I am continuing my reading. What I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I am reading in a chronological order of events, not according to publication or volume, so I will be skipping around a bit as I move along. So we are continuing in Ezekiel. We read 40 and 41, these last two videos. Just a very detailed architectural plan of the temple complex. Presumably the temple that will exist in the last days. Picking this up in chapter 42. Ezekiel sees in the temple the chambers for the priests. Then he brought me forth into the utter court, the way toward the north, and he brought me into the chamber that was over against the separate place, and which was before the building toward the north. Before the length of 100 cubits was the north door, and the breadth was 50 cubits. Over against the 20 cubits, which were for the inner court, and over against the pavement, which was for the utter court, was gallery against gallery in 3 stories. And before the chambers was a walk of 10 cubits breadth inward, a way of 1 cubit, and the doors toward the north. Now the upper chambers were shorter, for the galleries were higher than these, than the lower, and than the middlemost of the building. For they were in 3 stories, but had not pillars as the pillars of the courts. Therefore the buildings were straitened more than the lowest and the middlemost from the ground. And the wall that was without over against the chambers toward the utter court on the forepart of the chambers, the length thereof was 50 cubits. For the length of the chambers that were in the utter court was 50 cubits. And lo, before the temple were 100 cubits. And from under these chambers was the entry on the east side, as one goeth into them from the utter court. The chambers were in the thickness of the wall of the court toward the east, over against the separate place, and over against the building. And the way before them was like the appearance of the chambers which were toward the north, as long as they, and as broad as they, and all their goings out were both according to their fashions and according to their doors. And according to the doors of the chambers that were toward the south was a door in the head of the way, even the way directly before the wall toward the east, as one entereth into them. Then said he unto me, the north chambers and the south chambers, which are before the separate place, they be holy chambers, where the priests that approach unto the Lord shall eat the most holy things. There shall they lay the most holy things, and the meat offering, and the sin offering, and the trespass offering, for the place is holy. When the priests enter therein, then shall they not go out of the holy place into the utter court, but there they shall lay their garments wherein they minister, for they are holy, and shall put on other garments, and shall approach to those things which are for the people. Now when he had made an end of measuring the inner house, he brought me forth toward the gate, whose prospect is toward the east, and measured it round about. He measured the east side with the measuring reed 500 reeds, with the measuring reed round about. He measured the north side 500 reeds, with the measuring reed round about. He measured the south side 500 reeds, with the measuring reed. He turned about to the west side, and measured 500 reeds with the measuring reed. He measured it by the 4 sides. It had a wall round about 500 reeds long and 500 broad, to make a separation between the sanctuary and the profane place. If a reed is 10.5 feet, then 500 reeds are going to be 5,500 feet, something like that. But it would be it makes the temple more like a small village, where you have this outer wall that's a mile long and a mile wide. It fences off a 1 square mile area to separate the temple complex from everything else. And the priests, they have their chambers, again, 3 stories high. Like I think I said in the last chapter, it sounded like things were 3 stories high. So you have these 3 stories high. This is where the priests will eat the sacred things. Because in the sacrifice, the priest eats a certain portion of most, not all sacrifices, but most of them. The priest eats a certain portion of it as a sacred thing. And all priests, and Levites really, have to wear special garments when they are ministering in the temple. And so we have these chambers by the gate. So when the priest leaves the temple, or when they're doing their sacrifices, they take it and they eat it in their chamber. They each have their own little apartment. And they eat these sacred things in their apartment. And then they change into civilian clothes and exit the temple. They're not allowed to wear their priestly garments outside the temple. Those stay in the temple. That's why we have these chambers here. Very odd, very confusing on exactly how this is laid out. But it seems, again, the temple complex, the separate place, I think, is the temple itself. I think that's what it's referring to. Could be wrong, But that's what I think it's referring. You have the separate place, which is the temple itself, and it had chambers around the temple, but remember the chambers are not anchored to the temple itself. They have their own wall that they are anchored to, but it says they're not anchored to the temple. And then you have the inner court, which is the wall with its gates. Then you have the outer court, which is the wall and its gates. And then it seems that you have a third wall, which is out to making this a 1 square mile. So let's see that again. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how this is laid out, but that's how it seems to me. So in this whole complex, you have the main wall that separates everything else from the world. Then you have an outer court, which is part of the actual building. Then you have an inner court, and then you have the temple. And so you have this progression going in. You might, the temple has been compared, or the tabernacle has been compared, where you had the court is the telestial kingdom, the holy place is the terrestrial, and the holy of holies is the celestial. This almost seems like what we have is, you have the main area is the telestial, the outer court is the terrestrial, the inner court is the celestial, because that's where the temple is, and then the temple itself would be exaltation, if you want to draw those comparisons. This is also very similar to what John sees in the book of Revelation, but we'll talk about that later. So I'm going to leave that here, and we'll pick this up in the next chapter, so see you there.